The Walker family was once built on strength and certainty. Robert Walker had forged his empire with sharp instincts and relentless ambition, turning Walker Industries into a powerhouse that spanned finance, real estate, and technology. He had been the kind of man others feared and admired in equal measure, until Victoria came along. She had arrived in his life at just the right moment. Young enough to turn heads, wise enough to play the long game. After Ethan's mother passed away, Robert had been vulnerable, exhausted from grief and the weight of his empire. Victoria had offered comfort, stability, and, above all, a carefully curated devotion. Within a year, she was Mrs. Walker, standing beside Robert as if she had always belonged. But Victoria wasn't just a wife. She was a strategist. At first, her influence was subtle, suggestions about Robert's health, gentle nudges about who he could trust in his inner circle. Then, it became more pronounced. Longtime advisors were replaced. Old friendships faded. Decisions started passing through her before they ever reached Robert. And somehow, over the course of 2 decades, the formidable Robert Walker, a man who once commanded boardrooms with an iron will, had become a figurehead in his own empire. Victoria's daughters, Madeline and Claire, had benefited the most from her quiet coup. Raised in privilege but sharpened by their mother's teachings, they had been molded into her perfect successors. They didn't just dislike Ethan, they dismissed him. He was a relic of a past Victoria had worked hard to erase. To the outside world, they were the picture of a blended family. 2 elegant young women poised to inherit the family business. Their mother a gracious matriarch, their father a respected titan of industry. But behind closed doors, Ethan was an outsider in his own home. The family portraits displayed in their mansion told the story. His presence there was sparse, almost as if he had been cut out and replaced. Robert, blinded by years of manipulation, didn't see it. Or maybe he just didn't want to. He still believed he was in control, still thought of Ethan as his natural heir, even as Victoria continued to tighten her grip. But Ethan saw it. He saw everything. And she wasn't going to let them win. Ethan Walker had spent years pushing down the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. At first, it was small things, a shift in his father's demeanor, important company matters being decided before he even stepped into the room. Victoria's influence had always been undeniable, but lately, it had grown into something more sinister. Robert Walker, once a man who controlled every deal, every decision, now seemed like a guest in his own empire. The boardroom, once his domain, now bent to Victoria's will. Ethan had always assumed that when the time came, he would step into his rightful place alongside his father. He had worked for it, studied for it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he found herself being edged out. Key meetings were scheduled without his knowledge. Decisions he should have been involved in were made without his input. Victoria was closing the walls around her, tightening the noose. Then came the revelation that changed everything. One evening, after a long day of feeling increasingly like an outsider in her own company, Ethan overheard a conversation that sent ice through his veins. He had stopped outside his father's study, Victoria's low voice seeping through the heavy oak door. "Robert, trust me," Victoria purred, her tone dripping with false concern. "Ethan is unpredictable. He doesn't understand what's best for this company, for you. He never has. You've given his a good life, but it's time to think about the future, about protecting what you've built. That means ensuring the right people are in control." There was a silence, thick and suffocating. Then Robert's voice, weak but hesitant. "He's my son, Victoria, my heir. And I am your wife," Victoria countered, steel beneath her polished words. "You need someone who truly has your best interests at heart. You've seen how reckless he can be. I've taken care of everything all these years. Let me do this for you." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He had always known Victoria was dangerous, but this was more than manipulation. This was a calculated attempt to erase his from everything his father had built. His hands clenched into fists. No, he wouldn't let Victoria steal what was his. He had ignored the warning signs for too long. Now he would fight. Ethan's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he paced his office, his father's words still ringing in his ears. "He never has." Victoria had been weaving this web for years, slowly, carefully. And now, Ethan knew without a doubt that he was the final obstacle standing in the way of Victoria's complete control. If he didn't act now, he would be erased, just like his father had been. He needed proof. That night, long after the office had emptied and the building had fallen into silence, Ethan sat at his desk, eyes locked on his laptop screen. If Victoria was trying to steal his family's empire, there would be a trail, and Ethan would find it. He started where most crimes were hidden, the money. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Millions siphoned out of company accounts in small, calculated increments. The transactions had been buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy, reinvestments, shell companies, overseas holdings, but the pattern was there. Ethan cross-referenced records, tracing the movement of funds across multiple accounts, and Victoria's fingerprints were all over it. One name appeared again and again, a financial firm in the Cayman Islands. Victoria had been transferring assets out of the country, slowly bleeding the company dry. But the real horror came when Ethan found the forged authorizations. They weren't in Victoria's name. They were in Robert's. Ethan stared at the digital signatures, his stomach twisting. Victoria hadn't just stolen from the company. She had used his father to do it. If this ever came to light, it wouldn't just ruin Victoria. Robert would be implicated, branded a fraud, a criminal. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. That was the real trap. If he exposed Victoria, his father would fall with his. His mind raced. He needed help, someone who knew the law, someone who could protect Robert from what Victoria had done. There was only one person he trusted with something this big. Daniel Carter, the family's longtime attorney. Ethan grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his number. "Daniel, it's Ethan," he said the moment he answered. A pause. Then, "Ethan? It's late. What's wrong? I need to see you. Tonight." Another pause, longer this time. "Is this about the company?" Ethan swallowed. "It's about my father. And it's bad." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Come to my office. Now." Ethan shut his laptop, grabbed his files, and walked out the door. This was no longer about suspicions. This was war. Ethan stood in the grand dining hall of the Walker estate, the weight of the moment pressing down on his. The chandeliers overhead cast a cold glow over the long mahogany table where Robert, Victoria, Madeline, and Claire sat. The tension in the room was suffocating. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Victoria's sharp eyes flicked toward her, lips pressed into a thin line. "I assume you didn't bring us here for a family reunion," she said coolly, swirling the wine in her glass. "No," Ethan said evenly, stepping forward. "I brought you here to tell the truth." Victoria let out a soft chuckle. "The truth? About what?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the remote and pressed a button. The projector screen at the end of the room flickered to life. A series of documents filled the screen: bank transactions, property deeds, signatures. A roadmap of Victoria's crimes, laid bare for all to see. Robert frowned, leaning forward. What is this?" Ethan turned to him, his voice steady. "This is proof that Victoria has been stealing from you, from this family, for years. He's been siphoning company funds, laundering money through offshore accounts, and forging your signature to make it all look legitimate." A sharp intake of breath came from Claire. Madeline's face paled. Victoria, however, remained eerily calm. "This is absurd," she said with a practiced scoff. "You expect us to believe this nonsense? I don't know where you got these fabricated documents, but they aren't fabricated." Ethan cut his off, clicking the remote again. A video file began playing. It was a recorded call between Victoria and her Cayman Islands contact. Victoria's voice rang out through the speakers. "Robert is a fool. He signs anything I put in front of him. The company is already mine. He just doesn't know it yet." Robert stiffened as if he had been struck. His hands clenched into fists on the table. "Victoria," his voice was barely a whisper. But Ethan wasn't done. Another click. Emails. Exchanges between Victoria and a corporate lawyer, discussing how to block Ethan from his inheritance. Another click. A transaction log showing how Madeline and Claire's trust funds had been drained, used as a smokescreen to cover Victoria's own embezzlement. Claire shot up from her chair, her face a mask of betrayal. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." Victoria's silence was deafening. Madeline looked at her mother with wide eyes, then at the documents flashing across the screen. "You used us," she whispered. "You told us Ethan was the enemy, that she wanted to take everything from us. But it was you." Victoria's carefully composed mask cracked. "I did what was necessary," she snapped. "For all of us." "No," Robert said, his voice firm now, stronger. He turned toward her, eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in years, clarity. You did this for yourself. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had spent years being ignored, dismissed, pushed to the edges of this family. But now, standing in the center of the storm, he saw things for what they truly were. Victoria had built her empire on lies, but tonight, it all came crashing down. And Ethan? He was done being invisible. A heavy silence hung in the room, broken only by the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Victoria's face was pale, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. For the first time in years, she had lost control. Robert sat motionless at the head of the table, staring at the documents in front of him. His hands trembled as he picked up one of the forged contracts, running his fingers over his own falsified signature. How many times had he signed papers without question, trusting the woman beside him? He had handed over his company, his wealth, his very life, to a woman who had been playing him like a puppet. Slowly, he turned to look at Victoria. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Was any of it real? Victoria flinched. The last 20 years, he continued, his tone hollow. Was I ever anything more than a tool for you to use? For the first time, Victoria didn't have an immediate answer. The confidence, the cold calculation, it was all gone. What remained was a woman cornered, grasping for a way out. Robert, she started, but the words died on her lips. What could she say? That she had loved him, even while she drained his accounts and forged his name. That it had been for the family, even as she ensured Ethan would never inherit a cent? Robert shook his head. He had spent years in a fog, blinded by charm and deception, but now he saw her for what she was. Straightening in his chair, he turned to the group of men and women sitting silently at the far end of the table. The Walker Corporation Board of Directors. They had been called in once Ethan presented her evidence, and now, their faces were grim as they reviewed the documents. Robert's voice was steady, unshaken now. We need a vote. A murmur rippled through the room. Victoria's head snapped up. Robert, wait. Let's discuss this privately. But Robert ignored her. Effective immediately, Victoria Walker is to be removed from any and all positions within the company. Her access to corporate accounts, assets, and properties will be revoked. One by one, the board members raised their hands. A unanimous decision. Victoria let out a sharp breath, her nails digging into the table. You can't do this, she spat, her voice rising in desperation. I built this company with you. No, Robert said simply, standing up. You built a lie. At that moment, the deep rumble of engines sounded from outside. Police cars. Victoria's breath hitched. She turned to Ethan, her eyes burning with hatred. You called them. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. You did this to yourself. The front doors burst open, and uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence casting a shadow over the room. The lead officer approached, his voice calm but firm. Victoria Walker, you are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of legal documents. No, Victoria whispered. No, no, no. As the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, she stumbled back, looking to Madeline and Claire for support. Girls, do something, she pleaded. But they didn't move. Madeline's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mixture of anger and hurt. Claire wiped at the silent tears streaming down her face. We were just pawns to you, Madeline said coldly. We trusted you, and you used us. I don't even know who you are anymore. The betrayal in their voices cut deeper than any of the accusations thrown at her tonight. For years, Victoria had controlled everything, every detail, every person in this house. But now, she had no one left. As the officers pulled her hands behind her back and snapped the cuffs into place, she let out a bitter, hollow laugh. You think this is over? She hissed, her voice shaking. You have no idea what you've started. But as the officers led her toward the door, Robert exhaled, feeling the weight of decades lift from his shoulders. It's not over, he murmured, his gaze flickering to Ethan. It's just the beginning. And for the first time in years, he felt free. The courtroom was silent as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defendant. Victoria Walker sat stiffly in her chair, her once pristine designer suit now wrinkled, her carefully composed mask shattered beyond repair. The woman who had once controlled an empire with a mere whisper was now powerless. The court finds the defendant, Victoria Walker, Guilty on all counts, the judge declared, his voice ringing through the packed chamber. For financial fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of legal documents, the sentence is 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped. Others whispered in disbelief. But Victoria said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the table, her nails pressing into the wood, but she did not flinch. She had expected this, even if she had spent months denying it to herself. Her lawyers had tried every possible defense, twisting facts, shifting blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her empire was gone. Her accounts, frozen. Her properties, seized. The money she had so carefully siphoned over the years had been traced, and now, the court had ordered full restitution to Walker Corporation. Every dollar she had stolen, every asset she had hidden overseas, was being funneled back into the company she had tried to control. As the gavel struck, sealing her fate, she turned slightly, her eyes scanning the rows of spectators. She was looking for someone, anyone, who still stood with her. But Madeline and Claire sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. For years, they had been her shadows, her protégés, raised to reflect her beliefs, to follow her orders without question. She had taught them that loyalty was transactional, that power was the only thing that mattered. But now, they were the ones looking at her like she was a stranger. When the guards approached, placing cuffs around her wrists, Claire let out a shaky breath. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Madeline, ever the composed one, remained silent. But there was no anger in her eyes anymore, just exhaustion. As Victoria was escorted out of the courtroom, head held high despite her chains, she realized she was truly alone. The days following the trial were chaotic. News stations covered every detail of the case, dissecting Victoria's fall from grace. Former allies distanced themselves. Business partners pretended they had never known her, and the name, Walker, became synonymous with scandal. For Madeline and Claire, the loss was crushing. The trust funds they had relied on, gone. The lavish lifestyle they had taken for granted, repossessed. For the first time in their lives, they had nothing. But strangely, it was in that nothingness that they began to see clearly. Sitting across from each other in a small cafe, far from the grand estate they once called home, Madeline finally broke the silence. She lied to us. Her voice was hollow. Claire nodded, stirring her coffee absently. She used us. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but deep down, she knew they were true. Victoria hadn't just deceived the company, she had deceived her own daughters. She made us believe we were better than everyone else, Claire murmured. That we deserved more, just because we were hers. Madeline exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. And we believed it. We treated Ethan like he was nothing. We looked down on Dad, too blind to see what was happening right in front of us. Claire's fingers tightened around her mug. Do you think she ever really loved us? The question lingered between them, heavy and unspoken for far too long. Madeline hesitated, then shook her head. I think she loved the idea of us, of what we could be for her. But real love? No, she doesn't know what that is. Claire swallowed hard, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She had spent years defending her mother, excusing her cruelty, convincing herself that Victoria always had a plan, that it would all make sense in the end. But now, there was no plan, no grand strategy, just ruins. And for the first time, Claire and Madeline had to figure out who they were without their mother's influence. We can't change the past, Madeline said, meeting her sister's gaze. But we don't have to be like her. Claire nodded, her grip loosening. No, we don't. It was a small step, a hesitant, uncertain step, but it was a start. And for the first time in their lives, they were free to walk their own path. The grand boardroom of Walker Industries had never felt so full, yet so quiet. The tension in the air was palpable as the board members, executives, and legal advisors sat in expectant silence, waiting for Robert Walker to speak. For years, he had been nothing more than a figurehead, a once great businessman reduced to a mere shadow of himself under Victoria's control. But today was different. Robert sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture firm, his gaze steady. Beside him stood Ethan, the son he had unknowingly neglected, the man who had saved their family from destruction. As of today, Robert began, his voice carrying the weight of years lost to deception, I am resuming full control over Walker Industries. However, this company will no longer be ruled by one voice alone. Murmurs rippled through the room. For too long, I allowed myself to be manipulated, blind to the damage being done to this company and my own family, Robert continued. But Walker Industries is not just my legacy, it is my family's legacy. And there is no one more deserving to share in that responsibility than my son, Ethan. A moment of silence. Then, the board erupted into applause. Ethan met his father's gaze, seeing something there he had never truly seen before: respect. His return to Walker Industries wasn't about reclaiming power. It was about reclaiming his place in his own family. For years, he had been pushed aside, treated as an outsider in his own home. Now, standing beside his father, he was finally where he was meant to be. Later that evening, the Walker estate was filled with a different kind of energy. The grand dining hall, once a place of cold, silent meals controlled by Victoria's presence, now felt warm and alive. The fireplace crackled, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed through the halls. Ethan leaned against the balcony, sipping a glass of bourbon as he watched his father talk with the board members who had come to celebrate. It still felt surreal, the idea that they had won, that Victoria's reign was over. Not used to all this, are you? Ethan turned to see Madeline standing beside him, a cautious yet genuine smile on her lips. Claire lingered slightly behind her, looking unsure but present. Ethan raised an eyebrow. No, but I guess we're all adjusting to new realities, aren't we? Madeline exhaled. That's an understatement. Silence stretched between them. Not the awkward, bitter silence that had existed for years, but something else. Something almost hopeful. I know we can't undo the past, Madeline said finally, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. And I don't expect you to forgive us overnight. But we want to make things right. Claire nodded, her arms crossed as if she was bracing for rejection. We were raised to see you as a threat, as the enemy. But we know better now. She hesitated before adding, you tried to warn us about her, and we ignored you. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. You did a little more than ignore me. Madeline winced. Yeah, well, we were kind of awful, weren't we? Ethan studied them for a moment. For years, they had been his tormentors, looking down on him as Victoria's perfect protégés. But now, without their mother's influence, they weren't the same people. They were just two women trying to figure out who they were without her. I won't lie, Ethan said, his voice measured. It's going to take time. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. Madeline nodded, as if she had already expected that answer. We'll take whatever time you need. For the first time in years, Ethan saw them not as enemies, but as victims of Victoria's manipulation, just as he had been. Maybe they could rebuild. Maybe they could be more than just estranged step-siblings bound by a toxic past. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, the Walker family could be whole again. As the night stretched on, Robert joined Ethan on the balcony, watching as the party continued inside. You did good, son, Robert said, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan smirked. Coming from you, that means something. Robert sighed. I know I've made mistakes. I can't change what I let happen under Victoria's control. But I can promise you this. I will never let anyone take this family from us again. Ethan looked at his father and saw not the weak, manipulated man he had once pitied, but a leader. A father who was finally ready to fight for the people who mattered most. Together, they turned back toward the house, where Madeline and Claire were laughing over a bottle of wine, where board members spoke excitedly about the future of Walker Industries, where, for the first time in decades, the Walker family wasn't just surviving. They were rebuilding. And this time, they would do it right. The long dining table at the Walker estate had seen countless dinners over the years, some grand, some tense, and many filled with nothing but silence. But tonight was different. Tonight, the heavy shadow that had loomed over this family for 2 decades had finally lifted. Tonight, for the first time in years, the Walkers were truly together. The fire in the grand hearth flickered warmly, casting a soft golden glow over the room. A rich aroma of roasted lamb and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air, mingling with the sound of quiet conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. It was strange, yet familiar. The echoes of a family that had once been, now trying to find its way back to what it could be. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, watching as his father carved the lamb with steady hands. Robert Walker looked like himself again. The uncertainty, the self-doubt that had plagued him for so long was gone. His movements were confident, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of deception and regret. "Don't overcook it, Dad," Ethan teased, arching an eyebrow. "You always used to mess up the lamb." Robert smirked, but didn't look up. "That was years ago, and you were 5. I doubt you even remember." "Oh, I remember. You nearly burned the house down." Madeline and Claire chuckled, a sound Ethan had never expected to hear from them, at least not in a moment like this. There was something new in their laughter, something real. Madeline, who had spent years looking at Ethan with contempt, now looked at him with something closer to gratitude. Claire, who had once followed their mother's orders without question, now seemed hesitant but open, as if she was still learning how to exist in a world without Victoria controlling her every move. As Robert passed the first plate to Ethan, the moment felt strangely symbolic. A passing of trust, of responsibility, of family. Claire, breaking the silence, swirled her wine glass and smirked. "You know, I still can't believe you had all that evidence ready to go. The way you set Victoria up, it was like something out of a movie." Ethan leaned back, letting a slow smile spread across his face. "I learned from the best. She always said to cover my tracks. Guess she never expected me to use her own advice against her." Madeline exhaled, shaking her head. "I still don't know what to make of all of this. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing everything you believed in was a lie." She met Ethan's gaze, her voice softer now. "You were right about her all along, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." Ethan studied her for a moment before finally nodding. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Robert cleared his throat and lifted his glass. "Well, if we're talking about fresh starts, I think this calls for a toast." They each raised their glasses, red wine for Robert, Ethan, and Claire, and white for Madeline, just as she had always preferred. "To what?" Claire asked. Robert glanced around the table, at the son he had nearly lost, at the daughters who had been victims of a mother's manipulation, at the family that had been broken but not beyond repair. "To rebuilding," Robert said. "To second chances." They clinked their glasses together, the sound ringing through the air like a quiet promise. For the first time in years, there was no tension, no fear, no deception, just 4 people, bound by blood, mistakes, and a shared determination to make things right. And as they ate, as laughter replaced old wounds and conversation filled the spaces once held by silence, it became clear this was not just the end of a dark chapter. It was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for.